Welcome back, everybody. It is Brian Morgenstern and Sam Lyman here with the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod, talking election, talking Satoshi, talking Kamala getting warmer on Bitcoin and crypto. Lots to talk about today. Sam, you want to lead us in?
Yeah, much to discuss today. Let's start with the state of the race as we did last episode. There's so much going on. We've got, I think, about 18 days till election day, and the polls are narrowing in some places. But if you look at the betting markets, the divergence between Trump and Kamala is just getting wider and wider. So as of this morning, Trump has his largest margin over Kamala Harris. More than 20 points separate him and Kamala in the Polymarket polls. So Polymarket, for those who don't know, it's a betting website. The thesis is that it's more accurate than typical polls because there's skin in the game. People are actually putting money down with what they think is going to happen in the election. And after Kamala's, some would say, disastrous interview last night with Brett Baier, Trump has sort of blown the race wide open. He has a huge margin over Kamala, but it's not just the betting markets that are showing Trump having a significant momentum right now. We also have an NBC News poll that shows the race is in a deadlock right now. And this is a national poll. Mind you, Trump has never been ahead in national polls, not in 2016, not in 2020. But now you have NBC News saying that they're in a virtual tie on a national level. So there's a lot to talk about here. Brian, if you're in the Kamala Harris campaign right now, putting you in that hypothetical situation, is it time to hit the panic button?
Yeah, they are not peaking at the right time as early voting is starting and election day is just a couple of weeks away. The tailwind is with the Trump campaign for sure. You mentioned the NBC poll just, I think it was late last night, maybe. Fox News also released a national poll that has Trump leading by 2 points. That is highly unusual for Trump to be leading in the national popular vote. He even when he won in 2016, he was trailing in the national popular vote. Well, according to the polls, by about 7 points. On election day, it ended up being, I think, around 3 points. In 2020, the polling average, I think, had him trailing by 9 at this point in the race. It ended up being around 4. So these national polls, my point is, they generally are undercounting Trump's support. And over the last 2 elections, it's been somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 points in these national polls. So if you take NBC as even and Fox News as Trump up 2, he could be leading in the national popular vote by 4 to 6 points. That is likely an electoral college deluge, landslide, just complete obliteration. And when we're looking at the polling averages, again, many of which frequently undercount Trump's support in the swing states, he's now leading 6 out of the 7. The only one in the average of polls that he is currently trailing is Wisconsin, and it's by 0.3%. Okay, so this is from about a week ago. It's been updated. So he's improved on these numbers from October 10th. Thanks for putting that up, Dylan. Sorry, I didn't prompt you. So he's actually improved a little bit. And now the margin in that chart you showed, the national polling average was at 2. Now it's at 1.6. Trump is still leading Harris in every swing state, with the exception of Wisconsin, except now the margin is even smaller for Harris in that state. And most of those polls, again, undercounted Trump's support over the last 2 elections pretty dramatically, like outside the margin of error. So this is his best polling era, as my former White House colleague Kellyanne Conway pointed out. He's never polled this well before in the last couple of elections, and obviously one of which he won. So to circle back, to use the Trump weave and circle back to your direct question, is it time for the Harris campaign to panic? I don't know about panic. They still do have the media helping them, their turnout operation. I hate the cliche. It all comes down to turnout, but it does. So we don't really know what's going to happen. I do if I had to pick, I think Josh Holmes pointed this out or phrased it this way. If you have to pick, if you're placing a bet, look at Polymarket, I would rather be in Trump's camp right now than Harris in terms of the horse race, because he's got the momentum at the right time. And last time in 2020, remember, they tried to shift, or they thought momentum was going to shift because the Hunter Biden laptop story broke in October. Again, early voting was underway, but it was still pretty early. It could have affected the race. Independent polls from after the race showed that. It was suppressed by the media, and half the country never heard the story. I think we're a little late for another October surprise. I don't think we're going to have something dramatically change the momentum, and the momentum seems to be with Trump. End of rant. Sorry for the way too long answer, but that's my answer.
No, that was a good rant. And you brought up an interesting point that I've been thinking about lately. The October surprise. I've been surprised at the lack of a surprise so far. But then I realized with Trump, I don't know what other October surprise you can put forward. I mean, the man has been under the biggest media microscope in American history over really the last 8 years of his life, because he's been constantly running for president. Anything that Democrats could have thrown at him, they have right now. A lot of the things they've thrown at him, they've tried to wage lawfare against him. So I'm not saying that an October surprise can't materialize still for Trump. However, with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, they might still have something in their back pocket. The Trump campaign might have something in their back pocket that they could use as an October surprise against them. So, like I said, we've got about 18 days now to Election Day. Do you think that this will be an election that goes by without an October surprise, or do you think there's still a possibility of a surprise from either camp at this point?
No, there's always a possibility. There is always a possibility. I mean, they they somehow convinced half the public that Donald Trump, who had been famous for 50 years, was all of a sudden a Russian spy, and they convinced them of that for 3 years. COVID happened in 2020. The laptop story happened. They put out the fake suckers and losers story saying that Trump was denigrating veterans at a veterans cemetery, which we had 27 eyewitnesses say he never said anything like that. They came out with, I'm trying to think, for every Trump constituency, there was a hit piece saying actually makes fun of or is bad for this constituency. Farmers, religious people. I mean, it was just like the most predictable media hackathon that I think I had, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad. So I think the temperature is going to be turned up. Threat to democracy, blah, blah, blah. He's going to jail all his opponents, even though it's the Democrats that have been trying to do all this stuff to Republicans. I would expect the media to start, turning the heat up as much as they can if they haven't already. If a new surprise comes, I have no idea what the new surprise is going to be. That's why it's a surprise, but I wouldn't be shocked if there's something that is, portrayed as devastating to Trump. But now that we have election month instead of election day, it's harder for those things to have that much of an impact. Although I guess, yeah, and I mean, we just saw in Georgia, they set a record for early voting. So there's many hundreds of thousands of ballots already cast at this point. So I don't know. The short answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
The long answer is that pile of words I just threw at you.
Yeah. I mean, if they could come up with something as preposterous as Trump being a Russian agent, who knows what they're capable of. So the last thing on this subject that I want to touch on, I want to play devil's advocate sort of, because back in 2022 during the midterms, I was in a grad school class at the time in a very blue campus, and it was just a domestic politics class. And the professor was leading what felt like a therapy session because all of my classmates were beside themselves expecting the red wave. For those who don't remember, back in 2022, polls were very favorable for Republicans heading into the midterms. It was a much advertised red wave that come election day never really materialized. There was maybe somewhat of a red trickle. There was a lot of red support in Florida, but nationally, there wasn't a whole lot to celebrate for the GOP on election night back in 2022. But Brian, now this is where I have PTSD because I want to be optimistic about election day, but I'm getting eerie vibes of the red wave back in 2022. But it seems like we're confident that this year is more like 2016 than 2022. Do you have any thoughts on that front? Why do you think that this year is more like 2016 for the GOP than 2022?
Yeah, it's a good question. So number one, it's a presidential election year. In 2022 is midterms. Midterms generally have lower turnout, particularly among Democrats. Republicans are generally better at showing up in midterms. They have fewer people stay home on a proportional basis. The difference in 2022, I believe, and I believe data shows this, is that abortion was such a key issue in that race. And that was an issue that motivated single white female voters who tended to be on the liberal side voting, you know, really motivated by that particular issue. That voting bloc might have been more inclined to stay home, like in a typical midterm. This time they were very motivated to vote. So I do think that changed the dynamics quite a bit. I would add that in addition to it being a presidential election year where you get higher turnout generally, the abortion issue, I think, has fallen down on the list. The economy is now dominating, and immigration as well as has moved up to a great concern for voters. And so I think the combination of it being a presidential year and the particular issue set that is at the top of voters' minds changed the dynamics measurably from 2022. I think more comparable data is from the previous presidentials rather than the midterms.
Yeah, that makes sense. Inflation is top of mind for everyone right now. Back in 2022, people definitely were feeling the effects of inflation, but in the last 2 years, they're feeling them even more strongly. Immigration, too, like you mentioned. So the polls might be cause for panic for Democrats, but there are other signs outside of the polls that seem to show signs of weakness for the Kamala campaign. One of those is her attempt to do these media interviews. David Sachs called this the Kamala Harris doom loop. Back in August, he said if Kamala's numbers start to decrease, the campaign will have no choice but to put her out there in front of the American public to do these interviews that she was trying so hard to avoid. But the second the American public sees Kamala Harris doing these interviews, they recognize the lack of substance. They recognize the inauthenticity that's there. They recognize the scriptedness in the way that she keeps so closely to her talking points, and their assessment of her begins to decline. So this initiates this doom loop that she has to do more media interviews in an attempt to shore up her poll numbers, but that actually just hurts her poll numbers even more. And she's caught in this vicious cycle where the American people see Kamala Harris for who she really is. So it seems like Kamala Harris may have entered that doom loop recently. She has pitched the idea of potentially doing the Joe Rogan podcast, which if anyone watched the Bret Baier podcast last night, she would get absolutely eviscerated on Joe Rogan, but in the most chill way imaginable. I mean, Joe Rogan is at the end of the day a pothead, funny guy, comedian who's just the kind of person that America trusts because he's your average Joe. I mean, it's in his name, Joe Rogan, right? But he doesn't take any BS from the people he interviews. And if she were to actually go on Joe Rogan, she wouldn't be able to play the tricks that she did on Bret Baier last night by saying, hey, we're going to do a 30-minute interview and then show up 17 minutes late and say, actually, we've only got 20 minutes for this interview and have staffers behind her waving to Bret Baier to cut the interview off. She's not going to be able to pull that with Joe Rogan. So I think that's one potential sign of desperation. Another one are some of these ads that she's putting out. She's sending out these ads to try to get the votes of fence-sitting male voters. And then this is what I thought was sort of the most shocking attempt to bribe, or should I say, encourage Black male voters. She came out with an agenda for Black men. So this is another real sign of concern for the Kamala Harris campaign. They're actually hemorrhaging Black and Hispanic voters, so much so that she came up with an opportunity agenda for Black men. And by the way, before I get into this agenda, the opportunity economy, she unveiled that to the American people about a month ago. I don't think anyone still has any idea what the heck an opportunity agenda is. But let's talk about the opportunity agenda for Black men. There's some interesting highlights there. Can you pull that up again, Dylan? So here she talks about providing 1 million loans that are fully forgivable for up to $20,000 for Black entrepreneurs and others to start a business. Then she talks about the third bullet point, protecting crypto investments so Black men who make them know their money is safe. And then most incredibly, she talks about legalizing recreational marijuana and creating opportunities for Black men to succeed in this new industry. I mean, this is absolutely absurd, and it's the most pandering piece of policy slop I've ever seen. Brian, what do you make of this agenda? And then we'll dig into the crypto part too.
hey guys, here's some weed and money. Will you vote for me? I mean, it's really embarrassing. It's what's illustrative. Well, let me put it this way. So it took her hemorrhaging black male voters for her to finally say something nice about Bitcoin or crypto. I wish there were better circumstances, but it's nice to see something nice, I guess. Although she says she wants to protect the investment, the government don't help me, man. But we don't need the government protecting, especially when you can have a self-hosted wallet. You don't need that. So it's the most desperate, flailing, kind of insulting campaign pledge I think I've seen, I don't know, in many years, but we know why it's happening. Dylan, do you have that, the story from this morning? I think I sent you there it is. Yeah, see, some black voters in Georgia see Trump as a real option. And this reporter looked at months of polling data and did a number of interviews. And there's a bunch of quotes in the article. Read it for yourself. But one of the most telling was something that I've heard anecdotally from a whole bunch of people, really all across the diversity spectrum, but including black and Hispanic men, that they were doing better economically when Trump was president. They were making more money and things cost less. And they remember that. It's fresh in their memory. So for the first time since Grover Cleveland was running for his interrupted second term, we actually have an A-B comparison between the two parties, and voters, particularly black men, I think it's the economic piece that's motivating them to come over to Trump, because they just 4 years ago, they were making more money and everything cost less. It's not that hard. People were doing better. And so that's why this problem is arising for the Harris campaign. And the attempts to solve it, yikes. That is cringeworthy.
Yeah. Well, Brian, you brought up the fact that they're making less money than they were under Trump, and that's a very good reason to vote for Trump over Kamala. I think it goes even deeper. I want to dig in for a second into this idea of racial depolarization, because for so long, Democrats had a lock on a majority of black voters, a majority of Hispanic voters, but over the past 8 years, really since Trump came on the political scene, that trend has shifted significantly. And my theory behind that is that this all boils down to a class issue. And what is happening right now is the Democratic Party is undeniably becoming the party of the elite, of the upper class. I think you saw this most clearly last week when Barack Obama berated black men for not supporting Kamala Harris, calling them brothers. And he's saying, I think the brothers out there just can't stomach the idea of supporting a woman. How condescending is it to say something like that? But it's indicative of someone who has been ensconced in an elite bubble for the past 2 decades of his life, where he is so out of touch with normal Americans that the real reason they're not voting for Kamala Harris is because she has no proven track record as an effective manager. And to the extent that she has managed anything at all, being part of the Harris and Biden administration, she's tanked the economy, and their wages are worse, and the economy is really struggling under this presidency. I think it goes even deeper, though. The Democratic Party is facing a huge struggle right now because they are losing black and Hispanic voters to the Republican Party. Why is that? In large part, it's not that they're losing Hispanic and black voters, they're losing working class voters. So back in 2016, when Donald Trump came on the scene, it was very easy for white working class voters to secede over to the Trump campaign, over to the GOP. And the Democratic Party at that time said, essentially, sayonara, we're not going to miss you guys, because they were already rolling out the racial rhetoric of the 2010s that polarized so many people. However, they were able to keep a lock on a lot of Hispanic and black working class voters by convincing them that Donald Trump was incredibly racist and that the GOP itself was a racist political party. In fact, our country was irredeemably racist. This was the era of the 1619 Project, Ibram X. Kendi, Ta-Nehisi Coates, where the people at the top of our society were just pushing really hard on this idea that racism in America was worse than it had ever been. It was an astroturfed effort that, when you zoom out, this was done to try to keep the old Democratic coalition together, where they were trying to keep their working class voters in their party so they wouldn't defect to the GOP, which more and more was starting to represent the economic interests of the working class. And I think few things represent this idea better than an SNL clip from a few years ago. This was back in, I think, 2018, if I remember right. So SNL, I think they've got a lot of shoddy skits, but every now and then they hit on something truly subversive, truly countercultural, and truly interesting. And this was one of those skits. Just to lay the groundwork here, I think what this skit shows is that there's been an awakening amongst the working class right now that no matter what race or ethnicity you are, if you're working class, you have so much more in common with other members of the working class than the Democratic Party tells you. So, Dylan, do you mind playing this clip? This is Tom Hanks as a MAGA supporter on Black Jeopardy.
Okay, they out here saying this movie doesn't deserve an Oscar. Keely.
What is Tyler Perry's Boo a Madea Halloween?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, when that man puts on a moo-moo, I'm just transported.
I got to tell you, I love those movies. I bought a box set at Walmart, and if I can laugh and pray in 90 minutes, that is money well spent.
Oh, you know what, sir? I really appreciate you saying that. I like that. I really. Oh, it's all good. No, it's all good. It's all good. Trust me, it's all good. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. It's all good. Okay. Keely, is your pick.
Let's go to You Better for 6.
Okay, the answer. The mechanic says you owe $250 for new brake lines. Doug.
Well, what is, you better go to that dude in my neighborhood who fix anything for $40.
Well, you know Cecil?
Yeah, but my Cecil's name is Jimmy, and he fixed my refrigerator, my air conditioner, and my cat.
Yeah. Yeah, everybody's got a guy. Oh, you all right, Doug.
A good clip. So it clearly shows Doug, the MAGA supporter played by Tom Hanks, has so much in common with his fellow contestants there. And I think that's what more and more voters across the country are starting to recognize. The true party of a multi-ethnic working class is the Republican Party today. And the Democrats can no longer ignore that. And I think they're starting to realize that themselves. And that's why they're starting to focus more on the upper class. I think what's happening is let's apply a Marxist lens to this. False consciousness. I think there's this false consciousness out there that Republicans don't represent the interests of minorities and they don't represent the interests of the working class. But more and more, that false consciousness is starting to crumble. People are starting to recognize that the two parties have completely switched places. If you have Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney, the foremost warmongers in America, supporting Kamala Harris, it's a real sign that we are in the bizarro world of politics, that what was right is now left and what was left is now right. So, Brian, that's my take on the issue. Do you have any thoughts on that, though?
This has been pretty succinctly discussed by, I want to give a shout out to Batya Ungar Sargon. She is a commentator who has pointed out quite rightly in recent months and years that it really is a class issue, not a race issue. And the bottom line is the statistics show that under the Trump administration just 4 years ago, the middle class was expanding. Their wages were going up faster than their supervisors' wages. Purchasing power was very strong. Inflation was at like 1%. And taxes actually, for all the ads that I have pumped at me from the Harris campaign saying that he gave tax cuts, Trump gave tax cuts to his rich friends and the billionaires. It's not true. High earners pay more taxes. The state and local tax deduction is one reason why somebody with a nice house has a much higher tax bill today than they did before Trump's tax bill. And when you look at the distribution statistics, over, I believe it was 60% of the value of the tax cuts went to people who make between $50,000 and $200,000 a year, the middle class. He really did kind of restructure the economy. And then with his tariffs and renegotiated trade deals, he's bringing middle class jobs back, or he was anyways. So the policies were working. A followed B followed C, and it really was about class, not race. And I think that's why you have now, after people saw how Trump governed as president, now you have the people who benefited from his policies the most kind of realigning, and we're seeing a total salad, a crazy mix-up of political alignments. It happens every generation or so in America and in a lot of countries. So it's not unprecedented. It can be very surprising, though. It is surprising to see the Republicans who were viewed, I would say, during the W. Bush era as being more of the country club variety Republicans. Those people have now kind of migrated over to the Harris campaign with Dick and Liz Cheney. Now you have your more heterodox thinkers and working class leaders. You have the Teamsters, most of them pledging support for Trump in that recent Teamsters survey. You have Bobby Kennedy, a Kennedy supporting the Republican nominee, and Tulsi Gabbard. As JD Vance said, I think trading Liz Cheney for Tulsi Gabbard is a tremendous upgrade. So it really is just a pretty radical realignment, but I think it's based on people's well-being and economic interest. That's where I bring it back. I think you're right that it's about class instead of race, and the middle class was growing and doing better 4 years ago than they are doing now. You want to have a class problem, which is going to present a governance problem in your country, then you keep having this widening gulf, this yawning gulf between the haves and the have-nots. You are not going to have a stable society with that. You have to be able to grow the middle class. It turns out that bringing manufacturing, incentivizing manufacturing in the U.S., structuring the tax code to do so, having more energy so that you have low inflation, all these things actually do reduce that gap. And if you want to make it worse, inflation. You know what the worst cause of a gap between the haves and the have-nots, which leads to societal unrest throughout history? It's often inflation, because the people who own a home or stocks or precious metals, other hard assets, the value of those things inflate during inflation, which means the people who own them accrue more wealth. The people who are living paycheck to paycheck and depend on the value of our currency, when inflation is running rampant, the value of that currency goes down. The value of assets goes up. You want to have a yawning gap between the haves and the have-nots leading to civil unrest? Have inflationary policies like this administration has had. Profligate spending, money printing, engage foreign entanglements that George Washington has warned us about famously hundreds of years ago. This is what leads, these are empire busters. Overextension in wars, excessive money printing and spending, leading to inflation, leading to a bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots. This is how you have societal collapse. We didn't have that 4 years ago. People were doing better. They were making more money. Things cost less. We were not involved in foreign wars. Now we have the last 4 years to compare that to. People see it. They're waking up. End of rant.
Yeah, that was bravo. That was a solid rant, and honestly, a great case for Donald Trump. He represents everything that the Kamala Harris campaign doesn't. Kamala Harris campaign is perpetuating those empire busters, like you mentioned, and Donald Trump has come out and said, I'm against all those things, the inflationary policies, the forever wars, all the above. I want what's best for America, and that's my guiding star. That's essentially the ethos of his campaign. That's why he's come around to Bitcoin, too, because he recognizes that Bitcoin at its core is a very American idea. Of course, Bitcoin is international in scale. It's something that people have paid attention to since its inception. And since Bitcoin was invented, there's always been this age-old question. Who the heck is Satoshi Nakamoto? Satoshi Nakamoto, for those who don't know, is the creator of Bitcoin. His or her, you never know, identity has not been revealed. But HBO has made it their mission to unmask the true identity of Satoshi Nakamoto. So much so that they recently released a movie called Money Electric that tries to go on a detective story journey to uncover the true identity of Satoshi Nakamoto. And the documentary filmmaker behind this film has concluded that Satoshi Nakamoto is, drumroll please, Peter Todd. Peter Todd, who this comes out of left field for a lot of people who are very involved in Bitcoin. He a somewhat controversial figure within the Bitcoin community. He's an early developer. And at the very end of the documentary, they actually confront Peter Todd, accusing him of being Satoshi. Let's see how that goes.
A concept which you had envisioned years earlier, but you needed some kind of cover in order to make. And you also needed some cover for that 2010 post.
Yeah, because I was Satoshi.
I mean, yeah, you know, you're very concerned about all the privacy stuff. So you reach out to your old buddy Adam Back. You say, we need to do something about this, but we need to pay the devs. But you can't join Blockstream because it would look too suspicious. So you don't.
I will admit, you're pretty creative. You come up with some crazy theories. It's ludicrous. It's the sort of theory someone who spends their time as a documentary journalist would come up with. So yeah. I'll say, of course, I'm Satoshi and I'm Craig Wright. And yes, I was definitely covering that little bit about, fees to go pretend to be Satoshi or not Satoshi, one or the other.
Yeah, so Peter Todd is not amused, and some might say that's exactly what someone who is Satoshi would say. So let's give HBO their due. The evidence they present that Peter Todd is Satoshi is, first of all, linguistic similarities. You can kind of pick up in Peter Todd's accent, he's Canadian, right? And so being a Canadian, he uses Canadian spelling, which is very similar to British spelling, in a lot of his forum posts back in the early days of Bitcoin, which coincidentally, so did Satoshi Nakamoto. In addition, the hinge point that they use is that there's an exchange in the Bitcoin Talks forum back in 2010 that looks as if Peter Todd is Satoshi Nakamoto and he's having a conversation with himself and forgets to switch between accounts. He posts as Peter Todd thinking he's under the Satoshi pseudonym. So that's what they point out as the strongest evidence they have that he is Satoshi Nakamoto. It's still a really interesting question. The Bitcoin community, a lot of people roll their eyes at this. It's such a dark horse candidate, really, to be Satoshi. But Brian, I'm curious what you make of this. Do you think Peter Todd is Satoshi? If not him, then who? Does it even matter at the end of the day?
Yeah, I don't know is the real answer. The documentary, I think, is well done. It was entertaining. It's got some good Bitcoin knowledge in there. It's not a bad way to spend a couple hours for anybody who wants to watch it. But I don't think it's definitive by any means. Throughout the film, Peter Todd's in it for a good amount of time. And he spends a lot of the time trying the documentarian think that he is Satoshi or that he might be Satoshi or that he should definitely be on the short list to be Satoshi. And so, plays with him. He plays coy back and forth saying like, I'm not Satoshi, wink, basically, is how I'm characterizing it. And then at the end, filmmaker had compiled all this, made the case that if it's you, here's some evidence, why I think it is you or it could be you. And, Peter Todd's reaction to that is to kind of act like he's an idiot. Oh, you'll show this to Bitcoiners, they'll laugh at you, blah, blah, blah. And then he immediately tweeted on Twitter, I am not Satoshi. So that kind of left me with the, impression of like, thou doth protest too much, or that Peter Todd was just using this as a vanity project to make himself more famous on social media, which totally possible. I had always had my money on Hal Finney as a really, I don't know, odds-on favorite or something, maybe in the pole position. If I had to pick somebody who was Satoshi, who's a computer programmer who passed away, I think from ALS. And that would help, of course, explain why Satoshi's stack of Bitcoin has not moved. But the real answer, I think, is that it does not matter who Satoshi is or was. Part of the beauty of Bitcoin is that it is open sourced software. Everybody can see the code. Lots of developers work on it. It is verifying date stamps, timestamps, transactions, who owns what Bitcoin at what time throughout the world because of the decentralization. If government actors, and they talk about this in the film, if the identity of Satoshi were to be known, that person would be a target by governments, law enforcement, kidnappers, people trying to get a piece of his Bitcoin. I mean, that person would have to be under some of the highest security ever created. Of course, he could afford it because he would have 1 million Bitcoin at $60,000 or $70,000 a Bitcoin. That person is very wealthy. But the point being, Bitcoin is decentralized, and so there is no Mr. Bitcoin. There is no CEO of Bitcoin. That's part of the beauty of it. You can have Bitcoin on the network. You can have your own self-hosted wallet. You don't have to rely on a bank or a government or Satoshi or anybody else. That's part of why people really love Bitcoin, the ability to own it, the ability to transact with it, the economy of the future. Because it's open sourced, it doesn't really matter who Satoshi is. And I completely understand why Satoshi, if the person is still alive, which I think is a big if, many speculate that a bunch of possible Satoshis may have died already. If Satoshi's still alive, I completely understand why that person wants to be anonymous. And part of the beauty of Bitcoin is that you can be pseudonymous and not have your business exposed to everybody. Anyway, I don't know.
Right.
What do you
Yeah,
think? Who is Satoshi? Are we
Who's
all
the real
Satoshi?
Satoshi? Well, I agree with you, Brian. And I think to summarize, we are all Satoshi. We all have a stake in this network if we own Bitcoin. And that's the beauty of a decentralized monetary network. But it is, of course, fun to speculate who Satoshi might be. You mentioned Hal Finney. This, I think, was one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence I've seen that Hal Finney might be Satoshi Nakamoto. So I don't speak Japanese personally, but if you say the characters that make up the word Satoshi Nakamoto in English, they sound like Hal Finney. So reading the symbols, like if they were letters, it sounds very similar to Hal Finney himself. Another interesting point of evidence is that Satoshi Nakamoto, and this is going to transition to the next theory, roughly translates, from my understanding from Japanese, to something akin to central wisdom or origin of wisdom, or also central intelligence. Okay, so I want to talk about the tinfoil hat theory that Bitcoin might be an intelligence community project sponsored by either the CIA or the NSA. And Dylan, do you mind pulling up that next tweet? So the NSA actually published a paper back in the late 90s titled How to Make a Mint, the Cryptography of Anonymous Electronic Cash, with a source that includes a name, Tatsuaki Okamoto. So I think if we're just going to put on our tinfoil hats for a second, this would be really interesting if the NSA did this. I think it would explain why the true identity of Satoshi has not been unmasked, because the IC is really good at concealing secrets and not letting the American public know. In addition to that, I think it's an interesting hedge against hyperinflation. If I were a very powerful global superpower and my currency was the reserve currency of the world, I would still want to have some kind of backup, some kind of insurance plan in case my currency ever did experience hyperinflation. We could have a very hard currency to fall back on. What would that hard currency be? Bitcoin in this situation, arguably the hardest form of money ever invented. So I think those are two really interesting possibilities. Brian, any thoughts on either one of those?
I go too far down these rabbit holes. I haven't looked deeply enough into them to opine on whether either or both is a crackpot theory or could have some credibility. So I don't want to grade them on accuracy. I will grade them on interestingness. I think that the NSA theory or that the US intel community created this, I find very a really fun subject of like a novel that I would totally read. If they're trying to bust up illicit activities overseas, it's been pretty effective. I mean, the Silk Road seizures of Bitcoin have been some of the most valuable busts in history. Problem is, I don't trust that our agencies are coordinated well enough for the NSA or CIA to create it and then the FBI to actually use it effectively. I think that gives our government too much credit, frankly. But again, would be a great spy thriller. And who knows? I should probably dig more into these to try to assess what I think is credible and what isn't. I mostly just find them really interesting and generally think that it's fine if Satoshi's anonymous.
And like you said, it's important to keep Satoshi's identity anonymous, because if it's a single individual, like you said, they'd be a target for nation states, for criminal organizations everywhere. So I think it's important to respect Satoshi, respect his privacy, and appreciate just the incredible contribution he's given to humanity in Bitcoin. So with that, let's switch to our grab bag section. Every week we end our show with the grab bag. Brian, well, let's stay on the subject of Bitcoin for the time being. I know you had some grab bag items you wanted to point out involving Bitcoin.
Yeah, so the Bitcoin voter project, now it's two separate things, but the Bitcoin voter hack is something that I am helping to support. I think it's very important to help identify Bitcoin voters and educate them on what's at stake in this election. At the top of the ticket for president, Donald Trump has announced that he wants America to be the crypto superpower of the world and the Bitcoin powerhouse of the planet. The Harris campaign has been very coy. The Biden administration so far has been extremely hostile to Bitcoin. So if you care about this issue and want to vote, the Bitcoin Voter PAC has released an ad, and I wanted to share this as my grab bag segment because I think it's a really cool ad that some great people that we know helped create, and we want to just give them a shout out and a thank you. So Dylan, can you roll the ad real quick?
Hello, Bitcoiners. Thank you very much. Let me say it again. On day one, Kamala Harris's anti-crypto crusade will be over. It will end. It'll be done.
This election, you have the power to cast a vote for more than just a candidate. You can vote for a visionary who understands the transformative power of Bitcoin, a leader who sees the opportunities it creates for all of us. This is your chance to vote for progress, for financial liberty, for a future where our economy and society grow together, not apart. When you vote for the candidate who stands with Bitcoin, you're voting for the foundation of our collective empowerment, for the financial freedom that fuels our dream.
Vote for your future. Over Bitcoin. Over to you, Sam.
That's some good stuff right there. Yeah, Bitcoin is on the ballot this November. So you own Bitcoin, recognize that if we want to ensure its future, we need to have favorable policies towards Bitcoin and the build out of this ecosystem here in the United States. So that's something Donald Trump has been very forward thinking on, something that Kamala Harris is maybe catching up on. We'll see. I'm a little skeptical myself, but my part of the grab bag section focuses on Kamala's outreach to men. So we spoke earlier in our podcast about her outreach to Black men specifically. Let's check in on how her efforts towards men across the board is going. Can you play that, Dylan?
I'm a man.
I'm a man, man.
And I'm man enough.
I'm man enough to enjoy a barrel-proof bourbon.
Meat.
Man enough to cook my steak rare.
Man enough to deadlift 500 and braid it out of my daughter's hair.
You think I'm afraid to rebuild a carburetor? I eat carburetors for breakfast.
I ain't afraid of bears.
That's what bear hugs are for.
I'll tell you another thing I sure as shit am not afraid of. Women.
I'm not afraid of women.
I'm not afraid of women.
They want to control their bodies? I say go for it.
They want to use IVF to start a family? I'm not afraid of families.
They want to be childless cat ladies? Have the cat you want.
Woman wants to be president?
Well, I hope she has the guts to look me right in the eye and accept my full-throated endorsement.
Because I'm man enough to support women.
Man enough to know what kind of donuts I like.
I'm man enough to look Kamala Harris straight in the eye and tell her to accept my full-throated endorsement. Just the language behind that is disturbing and weird and not something a normal man would say. And I just love the guy on the truck sitting super awkwardly, like in this position. You can tell he's a paid actor. They're all paid actors, clearly. They're given their lines. And it's just the inauthenticity of this campaign makes me laugh so hard. Nothing that they can come up with actually speaks towards the men of this country. And I think that shows how out of touch the Democratic Party has become with men. Like, the Democratic Party has a massive man problem. There's been a huge exodus from the party to the GOP, and Democrats are beside themselves wondering, why are men leaving the Democratic Party? Maybe it's because you hate men, and the rhetoric of your party's leaders over the last decade has been anti-male in every particular. And so here is their last-minute attempt to try to appeal to male voters, but this just got panned online so hard, man. Like, oh, it was beautiful to see. From my understanding, a former Jimmy Kimmel producer put this together and then floated it to the Kamala campaign. The Kamala campaign said, we're actually not so sure about this. And then he took the initiative to release it himself. So from my understanding, this may be leaked through the Kamala campaign when they didn't want it to get out there, but it's out there in the wild now, and it's glorious and beautiful. So that's my part of the grab bag. Any thoughts on that really compelling political advertisement, Brian?
Yeah. Are you man enough to have tampons in your bathroom at home? It's just is, good God. I mean, it's pretty cringy. I understand they're aiming at humor, and I will say that they would not have taken this shot if they didn't think they're in a pretty dire straits. So, I don't. I, I finished watching it, and my mouth is just like hanging open. I was just like, "What? Why?" It's so out of. It's so cringy, so bad. So. Yeah, look, there's a few weeks to go. Pollsters have been so inaccurate in recent years, generally in one direction, but who knows? We will see what happens in a few weeks, but we may see our first Bitcoin-friendly American president elected. Who knows? We will see. I will say the Rorschach test of what we've seen in the news lately is pretty wild because, looking online, following the Harris interview on Fox News with Brett Baer, I was like, how can anyone vote for her? She had no answers to these perfectly reasonable questions and obviously was refusing to answer them and try to dance around, and he was trying to just keep her accountable. It was just, I don't understand how you could watch that and have it instill confidence in the candidate. And yet the partisanship blinders are so strong that I was looking at commentary online, and the typical foot soldiers were lining up behind Harris saying that she was, she proved that she could go in the lion's den and she held her own. Her answers were crisp and she was great and blah, blah, blah. Now, I know how the fluffing works generally with people who are paid to do it, or they're on the team, or they have some ulterior motivation, or if you're Mark Cuban, blink twice if you need help. Because you're a hostage right now. I understand how that works, but it seemed like there are a lot of people who were genuinely reacting to it, saying she did a really good job. That just has to be illustrative of how strong the partisan blinders are in this country. The brand loyalty that we talked about several episodes ago, and how strong that is. I don't know. Maybe we should interview like a psychologist or something to deconstruct that, because it's pretty wild that you can have people watch the same conversation and have such wildly, crazily different reactions. I don't know how that happens. Anyway, we covered a lot of ground today. This has been a lot of fun. But you have, are you man enough, Sam? That's what I want to know. Are you man enough
to vote for Kamala Harris? I'm proud to say I am not even remotely man enough to do that. But shout out to the men who find the testosterone in them to vote for Kamala Harris at the ballot booth and really vote against your own interests. Shout out to those guys.
Yeah. Well, everybody hit like and subscribe. Follow us on social media at MorganSternNJ, at SamLyman33. Send us your comments if you liked what we said, if you hate what we said, if you have questions, you want us to talk about something else, you want us to interview somebody, send us your suggestions. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time on the Peer-to-Peer Policy Pod.